Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I didn't get in until about 1:30 in the morning last night due to some flight delays. But I feel like I'm pretty awake now after some sugar. And it's good to be here. The talk I'm going to give today is very similar to what I gave in Spokane. But I'll be talking a little bit about future directions, and I tend to take tangents too on other research projects. For example, I'm becoming more familiar with southeastern forestry and fire ecology, and I've got a couple of projects going on in Eglin Air Force Base looking at these longleaf pine systems. And Paul Medley, I need to talk to you about that in this model you presented. I think there's good applicability for that. And I've got that LiDAR data that you want to use in that model. In the largest fragment of longleaf pine anywhere in the world, is my understanding, at Eglin.
Yes, it's very impressive.
So we'll talk about that. So what I'm presenting today is from the Priest River Experimental Forest in Idaho Panhandle. I'm not quite sure if that background is LiDAR from that forest, but there's some topography there, suffice to say, and it's a diverse coniferous forest. We've got 12 coniferous species in just that forest. And actually, it's not heterogeneity. I'm not sure where that came from in the title. It's heterogeneity. Although, I'm thinking about this word heterogeneity. I don't think it exists yet, but we're starting this new project looking at metagenomics, and where we grab some dirt and soil. Yes. In my PhD, I did some soil work, and boy, you work a lot for one data point. With remote sensing, you work with a lot of data points, especially with LiDAR. So I sort of like the LiDAR way better now. It is a paradigm shift from traditional forestry. Make no mistake about it. So I'll be presenting some of that to you today. And in terms of credibility, all you really need to know is that I can use a laser pointer. It gives me the credibility now, right? Do this talk. My disability, though, is I don't have three hands for these three different instruments. Okay, so to give you sort of an outline of what I'm going to talk about here today, I'm going to spend just a couple slides on what is LiDAR. You all have heard of LiDAR, but I'm just going to give you the brief synopsis of that, and then spend more time on what kind of information do we get from LiDAR that's relevant to people like us doing forestry work. I'm actually an ecologist, but I relate to the forestry community quite a bit now, and tend to go to more of these meetings than ecology meetings, because they see the value of LiDAR and they're ready to use it. I'm going to present this study from the Priest River Experimental Forest with some results, just looking at an analysis at canopy fuels and surface fuels that we did, looking at treatment effects, and then how we can assess forest fuel heterogeneity, both of canopy and surface fuels. So here's a cartoon of a plane with a LiDAR on it. The one thing about LiDAR is the principle of it is so simple. The reason you get accurate location measurements from LiDAR is because you have accurate clocks on the sensor to record the time in nanoseconds from when the laser is emitted from the plane, from the scanner. It goes down to the ground, is reflected, comes back, and if you measure that time and divide by 2 because you're going down and back, times the speed of light, then you get the distance. And then when you do the pre-processing, taking that signal, and I don't know how this is done exactly, with the triangulation and the mathematics and all, but you take the pitch, roll, yaw information from the inertial navigation system, and then your GPS information too, to solve for those locations. But a point I want to make is LiDAR is a paradigm shift too in terms of remote sensing from traditional ideas about passive reflectance, reflected solar radiation off the surface, to supplying energy like radar, LiDAR is like radar in that it supplies its own energy. It's an active remote sensing system. And it doesn't image the landscape. You've heard of imaging LiDARs, and for all practical purposes, some LiDAR systems seem like they do that because they sample at such a high density. But really, it's a sampling system. So this is my only animation. It's pretty exciting. So you have these dinner plate size pulses coming down from the aircraft, and they sample the canopy. So in a coniferous forests are nice because you can see the peaks of the trees, and it helps to get across the idea that not every peak is sampled by the LiDAR. In this case, only this tree was. So you get this distribution of heights with LiDAR. Some proportion of the returns actually go to the ground and get reflected back and are detected. And so you're getting actually three physical measurements from the LiDAR. You're getting height measures, some from the vegetation, some from the ground, which you have to sort out. And I'm going to get to that. But you also get an intensity measurement. Every pulse, when it encounters an object and is reflected back, will have some intensity between 0 and 255. That's information as well. But then if you look at this distribution of points, like just in this small area, the ratio of vegetation returns to ground returns gives you a physical measurement too of cover. And I've learned that these cover measures are just as important for predictive modeling for forestry attributes as height itself. Okay, so I'm already kind of leading into this next section on what information you get from LiDAR. So here's a point cloud. It's just color-coded by elevation, and this is a typical point density and a number of points for a forest inventory plot, a 10th acre fixed radius plot. And as I mentioned, you have to sort out these points. What represents the ground versus what represents vegetation? There's a variety of ways to do that, and I won't get into those methods, but typically the vendor does that for you. And this image depicts vegetation returns in green and the ground returns in black. That's very important in thinking about the classification, because the DTM that's derived from LiDAR is interpolated from just those ground returns. And so you need to be aware that this comes from a point cloud where that isn't done initially. So the classification can have a lot of influence on the characteristics of your DTM, as well as the kind of interpolation you do with those ground returns to get the DTM. So the intention then is, once you have an interpolated surface to the ground returns, like depicted in the upper left, then you normalize the point cloud. You normalize the heights in the point cloud. So you subtract that surface from the z values in the points and basically create a flat earth. So now your residual heights remaining in this point cloud represent canopy heights. So the more accurate your DTM, the more accurate, the more confidence you have in those canopy height measures. And I say canopy height deliberatively because you're not getting tree heights here, especially in a closed canopy forest like we work with in Priest River. It's canopy height. And to resolve individual trees, you really need more open canopy conditions like longleaf pine. And that's why I'm excited about doing this in longleaf pine, because I think there it's very feasible to get accurate tree level height estimates, not just canopy level. Whoops, I just mixed them up. Okay, so here's a simpler cartoon from some older data that I had. Also points from a single forest inventory plot. Now they've been normalized for topography, so the blue represents the ground, and this is a side view. And then you got these taller canopy height returns up here. But I thought this is interesting. You see this right here, and these are tree boles. And because it's an overhead system that operates at near nadir, actually the bowls are pretty much invisible to the LiDAR. It's interesting that we try to then, as foresters, most people care about the bowls more than anything else, but we have to infer things like stem diameters from height measures and from density measures, canopy density measures, and these elements are actually reflected off the needles and the branches or the leaves, the fine canopy elements, rather than the bowls. So here's a canopy height image, again coded in these colors by height. So blue represents 0. This is a harvest unit down here. This is a drainage. Here's a road. And the red trees are the tallest trees, going up to nearly 50 meters tall. This is maximum canopy height. So this is one of many metrics you can generate from LiDAR. And so for every 6 meter cell in the landscape, okay, I like to call them cells or bins. So we've taken the points within each one of those cells and looked at the distribution of heights and output the maximum height to render this image. So this maximum height is a very useful metric. And you can see the obvious patterns there. Tall trees are big trees, are old trees. It's a very useful metric. Here's sort of an artificially derived stand map. So hand drawing some stand boundaries around what look like more homogeneous units. So these are taller trees here and here. Here's a younger stand. Here's that clear cut. And these little graphs here have height on the y-axis and then the frequency on the x-axis. So they're like histograms tipped on their side. And with LiDAR data, typically that's the way to present it because we like to look at height vertically. But where you see this kind of big, broad distribution, this is indicative of uneven age and a lot of structural complexity. But when you average all that variation within a stand, you get a nice, broad, unimodal peak. This is actually old growth characteristic here. And then where you've got more even age structure, you get more pronounced peaks at some height. So this stand has a more pronounced mode in the peak, but it's shorter than this to stand up here, which is older, but still pretty even age structure. And then here's this other measure, physical measure of LiDAR, canopy density. So now this is the proportion of returns that are vegetation divided by the total. So that's a physical measure of canopy, what I call canopy density, ranging from 0 to 100. And the taller canopies also tend to be more dense. And of course, it's pretty much zero density in the clear cut. But you get these patterns in the landscape that differ from height patterns. And you see things you don't even see on the ground, like there's this interesting line here. And it wasn't, I've been to this location, but I don't know what's causing this line. And I don't know how many times I've shown this slide now, I keep saying, I need to go back and see what that line is. But you see features in the landscape from LiDAR because it's so detailed that you don't even notice on the ground, because it might just be a little subtle ridge of some sort on the ground. So not only can you measure density of the whole canopy, you can take vertical slices through that canopy, and that's what these images depict. So this is just kind of zoomed in, the center portion of this area. If you zoom in, this is the topmost canopy layer that I call stratum 6, and then stratum 5 just underneath, stratum 4, stratum 3, stratum 2, and then below 2 meters, I call it stratum 1 to get the understory, and then stratum 0 is just the ground returns. But these are very different patterns, and so these, when you feed these into a predictive modeling for basal area or volume, biomass, whatever, they are often all selected as useful predictors because they look so different because they're highly independent. I mean, these two are kind of similar, but you get very useful information there about the different canopy layers. Other metrics you can get from LiDAR. Now there's the DTM itself, and in places like Idaho, aspect is a huge influence on community structure and productivity. And so you can derive variables from the DTM itself as candidate variables for predictive modeling. And then you have these height measures and the intensity measures, and these are some of the metrics that we derive from the height distributions within these cells. I showed you an image of 6-meter cells. I typically use 20-meter cells for binning these points and then calculating these metrics. I like 20 meters because it's the same size cell as our field plots that we use for forest inventory, these fixed radius plots, about 400 square meters. So it takes away the scaling issues of using the same size model units as map units. And then here are these density metrics again. The strata that I just named, so there's a total canopy density of the whole canopy profile above some threshold. Usually I define that as breast height. And then these different strata. And then here's another one, texture. So just the standard, rather than the proportion, this is the standard deviation of returns within this understory height strata. I haven't found it to be very useful actually for any of my models so far. Okay, so how about some results for this Priest River study? So what I did is applied all these metrics into a model to predict basal area. And these were the metrics that were selected as the best predictors from the suite of candidate variables. And the best predictor is here at the bottom. It has the highest scaled variable importance. So this is a measure of variable importance that is output by an algorithm called random forest. And it's a regression tree approach to modeling. And I don't want to get into different modeling approaches, but this is one that I've found to be very useful. It's an R package for free. And random forest bootstraps to your data, so it tests different variable combinations, and it withholds some data for validation. And so it's a really robust way to assess which variables are your stronger predictors. And in this case, the percent of the first returns that are greater than mean height was the best predictor. And then this stratum 5, sort of an upper level canopy density layer. And then the percent of first returns greater than the modal height. So wherever that peak is the mode. And then maximum height, the modal height itself, 2 other strata, the DTM elevation, and then the 25th percentile of height. So these I settled on as the best predictors for a model. And then I used an imputation modeling approach to predict basal area, but other response variables too. So these are some response variables, structural attributes that are summarized using Forest Vegetation Simulator. And this shows 9 responses. And you can use regression for predictive modeling, but I like imputation because you can predict multiple responses simultaneously. And you can also predict response variables that are really difficult to predict, like, for example, surface fuels. That's this one right here. So we got basal area up here, stand density index, crown competition factor, top height, quadratic mean diameter, total cubic feet, a volume measure. We've got total carbon in the canopies, so standing total carbon, and then surface fuel total carbon, and then trees per acre. So in every plot here, the x-axis is the prediction from the model, and the y-axis is what was observed. And each dot in each plot represents a field plot. So some things you can predict well with LiDAR. Basal area. This is the correlation between predicted and observed, 0.81. And RMSD, It's very similar to RMSE, but with imputation, because you're actually assigning measured values from some plot in your pool of data to unmeasured locations, we call it a root mean square difference instead of a root mean square error, because it's the difference between two measured values, two observations, rather than the difference between your prediction and the observed value. With imputation, your predictions actually are measured values from other locations. So it's like filling in missing data. I can talk more about later about imputation. But then something like stand density or CCF, you can predict pretty well. Top height is consistently the best thing you can predict from LiDAR, which makes sense. But QMD, not so good. Volume, you tend to do well. This is standing total carbon, so that's in the trees. But then surface fuels, look at that correlation. It's just like a shotgun. It's no good. And also trees per acre. This is a closed canopy forest, so LiDAR doesn't do a good job of getting stand density. How about some maps now? So this is the Priest River Experimental Forest. This is a DTM in the background. And these red dots represent those plots that I use for modeling. So the same dots that were in the scatter plots are these dots here now. The elevation varies by about 1,000 meters, a little more than 1,000 meters. And one thing you notice immediately is that our plot distribution is biased towards the lower elevations. This is problematic for building a model that you want to do landscape level mapping with and landscape level inference. Just last week I got my hands on some new data from Priest River that the FIA program, they did an intensified sample grid within this experimental forest. So we have 60 new independently sampled plots in a systematic grid across this forest. And I'm going to use those for modeling instead, and then maybe use these plot data here for validation. But anyway, I'll forge ahead with results I already have. And I predicted basal area based on these plots. And I'm going to compare treated versus treatment units versus control areas within this kind of area here that I've outlined, where the area that's untreated outside these treatment units is about equal in area to the area inside, the total area inside the treatment units. Now I've switched the background to a maximum canopy height image, so you can kind of get a sense for where the taller trees are at Priest River. This is that most powerful predictor variable, the percent of first returns above mean height. Here is stratum 5, very different patterns across the landscape. So that's canopy density in the upper canopy stratum. Here's stratum 4, a little bit lower. Here's stratum 3, mid canopy. And those bright spots are the younger stands that are out there. So that's where most of the biomass happens to be in that height interval. And this is now my response variable. This is basal area that I've mapped. So this is what I predicted across that area. So now let's zoom in to this kind of area where the treatment units are. So you can see the treatment units in the colored small polygons, and then the control area outside. So then what I just did is in ArcGIS summarize these pixel values inside versus outside the treatment units to do a comparison of treatment effects. So you can see already just from the map that basal area is much less inside these treatment units, where it's darker and where it's brighter than outside the treatment units. Standing fuel, this is canopy fuels now, tons per acre. Very similar pattern in that variable as basal area, which makes sense. So I'll just toggle back and forth there so you can see that. But what if I go to surface fuels? Oh my God, it's noisy. And this was that variable, remember the R squared, the correlation was like 0.04. It was a really bad prediction. And so I'm not going to stand up here and pretend to tell you that LiDAR is sensitive to surface field distributions underneath closed canopies. Okay, it's not. If there's any kind of signal there, it's going to have to filter through a lot of noise to get at that signal. Nevertheless, we can get a prediction. And one thing about imputation I like is because you're using observed values to populate your map, you may not get accurate predictions, but you still get reasonable predictions because you've measured those on the ground. And they tend to be a lot less biased than you might get from a regression approach. So this is my shotgun of predicted surface fuels. And then just to maybe get at this final question, can we characterize forest fuel heterogeneity, both in standing and surface fuels with LiDAR? So here are some box plot comparisons. First on the left of basal area, this was my response variable in the model that was driving the model. And then I also predicted these other two variables, standing fuel and surface fuel, as ancillary variables with this imputation approach. So in each plot on the left is the control and on the right is the treatment units. And so you can see much higher basal area in the control than in the treatment. Same with standing fuel. And not so much of a difference in surface fuel. Maybe there is a difference, but actually being on the ground, there isn't much difference. And it seems like, it's basically management effects out there that is sort of determining what kind of surface fuels there are, depending on the treatment they implemented in those units. And then we're also asking questions about heterogeneity. So we're looking not just at the means in these top three graphs, but the variability. So this is the coefficient of variation on these bottom three graphs. Here's basal area. You can see how much more variability there is in the treated areas. So we definitely succeeded in creating heterogeneity in the standing fuels. Much more variability. Surface fuel, well, not so much. And actually, there's more variability in surface fuels as predicted from this model in the control areas than in the treatment units. And that's probably the case, actually. I mean, being on the ground, I see more clutter outside the treatment units. And that's it. That's what I wanted to present here today, to give you some relevance for how we use LiDAR for forestry. And again, I'm excited to kind of get more involved with southeastern forestry issues here. And I'd like to acknowledge National Fire Plan for that Priest River study funding, and the station where I work, Rocky Mountain Station. And then thank Pat and University of Florida and SAF for inviting me here. Thanks very much. Yep, Paul?
Yeah, I know LiDAR is typically not really great for mid-story and understory type identification, but do you see maybe LiDAR in concert with some other technology that might help to improve looking at mid-story and understory in thick canopy situations?
Yeah, the other technology to use to look at mid-story and understory canopies is LiDAR. Actually, there's nothing better than LiDAR, and only LiDAR really, to get at that. I mean, you could talk about spectral data at certain times of year, like in coniferous forest where I'm from, you've got this green coniferous canopy, but then the shrubby understory can, it's deciduous, turns color, and so you can get estimates of that, but there's that phenological variations. And actually LiDAR does a good job of getting mid-story and understory. It's just that surface layer. It's the clutter on the ground like you would have from surface fuels that it's not so good at getting at. But it's still the best thing out there in terms of remote sensing. And if your point density is high enough, I've stumbled on a DTM actually by accident once from Western Oregon forest, where it's really high biomass, very dense forest. And they use a classification approach that actually we developed at our lab. And when they interpolated DTM, you could see the logs in the DTM on the ground. And it was like, wow. And this morning I ran to my room and I was just trying to find an image to just insert in this talk, and I couldn't find it. It's kind of still bugging me.
We definitely need to talk. I mean, there's, I guess, you know, a resolution issue might be what we're dealing with. I've seen some nice high-resolution LiDAR, but I think we would have some application for that. So let's visit. Yeah, and keep in mind that I'm mapping at a 20 meter by 20 meter scale here that I'm calculating these metrics at. So I'm not really trying to do fine scale mapping, but with higher density data, it's feasible. And in more open canopies, boy, you can see everything. You know, like in the longleaf pine, you're not going to hide anything from the LiDAR there. Yeah.
Could you talk about that variable that was the better predictor for basal area? I think I know what it means, but could you tell me what that is?
Yeah, so it was a variant of a density metric. So it was the percent of first returns above mean height, I believe that was. So if you look at that distribution of heights, there's a mean somewhere in that distribution, and then it calculates, well, what's the percent of first returns that are above that height versus in the whole profile. And then the other metric there was, what's the percent of first returns above the height mode? Now, many of these distributions are not normal, and so the mean won't occur where the mode is. Typically, the mode might be higher if it's like most of the biomass is in the upper canopy. And so those kind of tell you two different things. And all these metrics are kind of just ways of describing the distributional shape. Well, I'll just leave it at that. The distributional shape, yeah.
So basically a height variable. I mean, like some way of describing total height, or
it's sort of
height-ish.
It's kind of looking at the interaction between height and density, yeah.
So how many terms for this LiDAR?
I think this was 8 to 10 points per square meter.
So these are the points in the ground, not the terms for poles, right?
Right, points. Yeah.
And is this scalable doing full-wave form, or?
Not this particular data set, but many systems out there now are capable of doing that. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. I think we'll hold questions for now, and there may be time at the end. And appreciate the presentation very much.